The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Carter County Historical Society in Elizabethton, Tennessee, creating a rhythmic percussion that had become the soundtrack to Dr. Sarah Mitchell's afternoon. She adjusted her reading glasses for the third time in as many minutes, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the fragile photograph under the magnifying lamp. The lamp's bright LED light cast harsh shadows across her desk, illuminating every crack and discoloration in the century-old image. After 3 decades of archival work, cataloging everything from Civil War letters to Depression-era farm records, she thought nothing could surprise her anymore. She was profoundly, dramatically wrong. The photograph before her measured approximately 5 by 7 inches, printed on heavy cardstock that had yellowed with age but remained remarkably intact. It showed a wedding couple from 1899, captured in that distinctive sepia tone that marked the era. The bride wore a simple white dress with delicate lace trim along the collar and cuffs, her dark hair pulled back in the Gibson girl fashion that had swept the nation. Her face was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that stared directly at the camera with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Not happiness, exactly. Something more complex. More resigned. The groom stood beside her in a dark suit that had clearly been borrowed or handed down. The sleeves were slightly too short, revealing white shirt cuffs at his wrists. He was tall and lean, with strong features and a thick mustache in the style of the time. His hand rested on the bride's shoulder in what should have been a gesture of affection and possession, the traditional pose of newly married couples. They stood in front of an ornate mirror that hung on a rough wooden wall, the kind of looking glass you'd find in any modest Appalachian home of the period. The mirror's frame was simple but elegant, probably pine or oak, darkened with age and at first glance. The photograph appeared to be an ordinary wedding portrait, tender and intimate in the way that Victorian-era photographs tried to be despite the long exposure times that prevented natural smiles. Sarah had seen hundreds of similar images in her career, young couples frozen in time, their hopes and dreams preserved in silver halide and albumin, but something was profoundly, impossibly wrong. Sarah leaned closer, her breath fogging the protective glass sleeve that encased the photograph. In the mirror's reflection behind the couple, the bride appeared exactly as expected, her back to the viewer, the rear of her white dress visible, her dark hair styled just as it appeared from the front. The reflection was perfect, precise, exactly what the laws of physics demanded. However, the groom's reflection told an entirely different story. In the mirror, his image showed him facing completely away from the camera, his back fully turned to his bride. Not just turned slightly, not just looking away, but completely reversed as if he had spun 180 degrees. His shoulders faced the wrong direction. His head was turned completely around. It was as if 2 different photographs had been merged, showing 2 different moments in time, 2 different realities. That Sarah's colleague, Marcus Chin, leaned over her shoulder, his coffee mug pausing halfway to his lips. His breath caught audibly. Neither spoke for a long moment, the only sound the continued drumming of rain against the windows and the soft hum of the building's ancient heating system kicking to life. "That's impossible," Marcus finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm outside. Unless it was deliberately staged," Sarah finished his thought, her mind already racing through the possibilities. But why? Who are these people? And more importantly, how did they do this in 1899? Marcus set down his coffee mug carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might damage the precious artifact before them. He pulled up a chair and sat beside Sarah, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "The technology existed," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "Double exposure techniques, composite printing. But it was expensive. Complicated. You needed a skilled photographer, specialized equipment, and a lot of time. This wasn't something you did casually." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. A wedding photograph in these mountains in 1899 was already a significant expense for most families. To pay extra for this kind of manipulation? There had to be a reason. A message. The photograph had arrived that morning in a dusty cardboard box, the kind that had once held shoes or perhaps kitchen supplies, now repurposed for storing memories. It was donated by the estate of Evelyn Thornton, who had passed away 3 weeks prior at the remarkable age of 103. According to the accompanying letter from Evelyn's granddaughter, a woman named Rebecca who lived in Knoxville, the old woman had kept this photograph hidden in her attic for over 70 years, tucked away in a small wooden box along with a handful of other family items. Evelyn had never displayed it on her walls with the other family photographs. Never spoken of it to her children or grandchildren. Never explained why she kept it or what it meant. My grandmother was very particular about what she would and wouldn't discuss, Rebecca had written in her careful cursive. The few times I asked about the box in the attic, she would change the subject or simply leave the room. After she passed, we found it while cleaning out her house. There were several other photographs in there, some letters, a baby's christening gown. But this photograph was wrapped separately in cloth, as if it needed special protection. Or perhaps as if my grandmother couldn't bear to look at it. Sarah flipped the photograph over with careful, practiced movements, handling it with the cotton gloves she always wore when dealing with historical documents. On the back, in faded brown ink that had been applied with what looked like a steel nib pen, someone had written in a careful, educated hand, Thomas and Elizabeth McKenna. Wedding day. October 15, 1899. God forgive us all. The words sent a chill through Sarah's spine despite the warmth of the office. God forgive us all. Not God bless this union, or may they find happiness, or any of the other conventional sentiments you might expect on a wedding photograph. God forgive us all. It was an epitaph, a confession, a plea for divine mercy. She had spent years, decades, really, researching Appalachian families. She knew their hardships intimately, the poverty that gnawed at every generation, the isolation that shaped their culture, the resilience that allowed them to survive when others would have given up. She understood their deeply held traditions, their fierce independence, their complex relationships with faith and family and land. This photograph represented something she had never encountered before in all her research, a deliberate alteration of a wedding portrait, the most sacred documentation of a marriage, the one image that was supposed to represent hope and future and the joining of two families. We need to find out who they were, Sarah said, her historian's instinct fully awakened, that familiar excitement building in her chest that she always felt when stumbling onto a genuine mystery. There's a story here. Something significant happened that day. Something that affected not just this couple, but apparently multiple generations of their family. Marcus nodded, already pulling up the digital census records on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The Carter County Historical Society had finally joined the 21st century 2 years ago, digitizing most of their records and gaining access to various genealogical databases. McKenna isn't an uncommon name in these mountains, he said, scrolling through screens of data. There were probably 24 McKenna families living in Carter County in 1899. This could take weeks to sort through. Then we start now, Sarah replied, carefully placing the photograph in an archival sleeve made of acid-free plastic, then logging it into their database with a detailed description and high-resolution scans from multiple angles. Outside, thunder rolled across the Tennessee hills, echoing through the valleys and hollows where the McKenna family had lived more than a century ago, where they had farmed and prayed and loved and died, leaving behind only fragments of their existence, land deeds and census entries, and one very strange photograph. As Sarah began her research, pulling up birth records and marriage licenses and property transfers, she couldn't shake the image from her mind, that backward-facing reflection. In all her years studying historical photographs, examining thousands of images from the 19th and early 20th centuries, she had never seen anything quite like it. Photographic manipulation certainly existed in 1899. Spiritualists used it to create fake ghost images, selling them to grieving families desperate for evidence of life after death. Portrait photographers would sometimes combine multiple exposures to create idealized images. The techniques were well known, if not widely accessible, but this was different. This wasn't trying to fool anyone or create something beautiful. This was deliberate, purposeful communication. Someone had paid good money, money that mountain families in 1899 rarely had to spare, to create this image. They had convinced or commissioned a photographer to execute this complex technical feat, and they had done it on their wedding day, transforming what should have been a joyful commemoration into something else entirely. A warning? A confession? A cry for help? The answer, she would discover over the coming weeks of intensive research, lay buried not just in census records and church documents, but in the hard red soil and harder memories of Appalachian mountain life, in a story of love and duty and impossible choices that would haunt a family for 4 generations. The morning of October 1st arrived cold and crisp in the mountains, the kind of morning that reminded everyone that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Thomas McKenna stood on the narrow porch of his family's cabin, watching the mist rise from the valleys far below, creating ghostly shapes that drifted between the trees. At 26, he was considered not just a good catch but an excellent one in Carter County, strong enough to work from dawn to dusk without complaint, sober enough to be trusted with money and decisions, and the owner of 40 acres of decent farmland inherited from his father, who had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. The land wasn't flat, of course. Very little land in these mountains was flat. But it had good southern exposure, a reliable spring, and enough timber to provide firewood and building materials for years to come. His hands bore the calluses and scars of constant work, splitting wood, plowing fields, building fences, repairing the constant damage that mountain weather inflicted on buildings and equipment. His face was weathered by mountain sun and wind, lined beyond his years in the way of men who worked outdoors regardless of season. And his heart, that traitorous organ that should have been focused on duty and family and the future, belonged entirely to someone he could never have. Someone he wasn't even supposed to think about, let alone love with the desperate, consuming intensity that kept him awake most nights. Thomas! His mother's voice cut through his thoughts like an axe through kindling, sharp and impossible to ignore. Come eat. You've got work today and you'll need your strength. Martha McKenna had raised 5 children in these unforgiving mountains, burying 2 of them, both boys, before their 5th birthdays. One had been taken by fever, the other by an accident with a horse that still made her flinch when she thought about it. She was a practical woman who believed absolutely and without question in 3 things: hard work, regular church attendance, and family obligations. She had been planning Thomas's marriage since he turned 20, carefully evaluating every eligible young woman in the county, weighing their family's land holdings against their reputations for hard work and moral character. Inside the small cabin, which measured perhaps 20 feet by 16 with a sleeping loft above, the smell of biscuits and salt pork filled the confined space, mixing with wood smoke from the cast iron stove that served for both cooking and heating. His younger brother, Samuel, sat at the rough wooden table that their father had built 15 years ago, shoveling food into his mouth with the unthinking enthusiasm of a 17-year-old who worked from dawn to dusk and burned calories faster than he could consume them. Despite the hard labor, Samuel remained rail-thin, all knees and elbows and enthusiasm. 2 more weeks, Thomas, Martha said, setting a tin plate before him loaded with 4 biscuits, a thick slab of salt pork, and a spoonful of apple butter from their own trees. 2 weeks until you're a married man. Elizabeth Harmon is a good girl. Obedient. Knows how to work. Her father has 20 acres adjacent to ours on the eastern boundary. Together, you'll have enough land to support a real family, maybe even hire help during harvest season. Thomas nodded mechanically, his appetite gone despite the hours of work he'd already done that morning, feeding the livestock and chopping wood. The marriage had been arranged 6 months ago, negotiated between Martha and Jacob Harmon over the course of several Sunday dinners after church. It was a practical union between 2 families who had known each other for generations, whose land shared a common boundary, whose combined resources would create something more substantial than either possessed alone. He had met Elizabeth Harmon perhaps a dozen times in his life, at church services and community gatherings, had exchanged maybe 100 words with her over the years. She was quiet, obedient, and completely unremarkable, which made her perfect by his mother's exacting standards. "You don't seem excited," Samuel observed, finally pausing in his eating long enough to study his older brother's face. Most men about to get married show some kind of feeling about it. Happiness, nervousness, something. "He's nervous," Martha answered for him, as she always did, as if Thomas were still a child incapable of speaking for himself. "All men are before their wedding. It's perfectly natural. Your father was the same way," though he settled in quick enough once the ceremony was done. What wasn't natural, Thomas thought but would never dare say aloud, was marrying someone you didn't love while the person you did love lived just 3 miles down the valley, forever out of reach, forbidden by every law of God and man and mountain custom. That afternoon, after helping Samuel repair the chicken coop that a fox had damaged the night before, Thomas walked to the Harmon farm ostensibly to discuss wedding arrangements but really because his mother had insisted he make the effort, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and that expression on her face that meant arguing was useless. The October air smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves, that distinctive scent that meant winter was coming. The mountains were dressed in their autumn finest, deep reds from the sourwood trees, burning oranges from the maples, golden yellows from the hickories and poplars. It was his favorite time of year, always had been since childhood, and it was being poisoned by his impending marriage, tainted by the knowledge that his last days of freedom were numbered and dwindling. The walk took nearly an hour, following a rough path that wound between properties, across streams, through stands of trees that blocked the sun and made the air smell of earth and mushrooms. Other people were out too. He passed Mrs. Dunlap heading home with a basket of herbs, exchanged greetings with old Henry Walsh who was mending a fence. The mountain community was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Jacob Harmon met him at the door of their cabin, which was slightly larger than the McKenna place but in worse repair, the porch sagging and several window panes cracked. Jacob was a bear of a man with gray streaking through his black beard, hands like ham hocks, and a voice that carried across valleys. Thomas. Come. Elizabeth's helping her mother with the sewing, but we can talk business. Man to man. Business. That's exactly what his marriage was. A transaction, a merger of property lines, a strategic alliance between families. Nothing more and certainly nothing less. They sat in the small front room, which doubled as the family's main living space, furnished with handmade chairs and a table scarred from years of use. Jacob poured them each a measure of whiskey, illegal but common in these mountains where the law was distant and enforcement sporadic. They discussed practical matters with the thoroughness of men negotiating a land deal. How many guests would attend? Probably 50 or 60, if the weather held. Where would the ceremony be held? The Methodist church in town, they decided, because it was larger than the Baptist church and centrally located. Reverend Patterson had already agreed to perform the service. How would the land be divided and worked? Thomas would continue working his family's 40 acres while also helping Jacob with his 20, particularly during planting and harvest. When Jacob passed, and he said this matter-of-factly, without sentiment, Elizabeth would inherit his land, effectively giving Thomas control of 60 acres total. That was a substantial holding in these mountains, enough to support a large family, enough to establish the McKennas as people of property and influence. You'll do right by her, Jacob said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a warning dressed up as casual conversation. Elizabeth's a good girl. Obedient. Never given us a moment's trouble. She'll give you strong sons, God willing, and she knows how to work. She can cook, clean, sew, preserve food, milk cows, 10 chickens. Everything a mountain wife needs to know. Thomas nodded, drinking the harsh whiskey and feeling it burn down his throat, wishing it could burn away his doubts and fears and the persistent ache in his chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. She's also delicate, Jacob continued, his voice dropping slightly. Not weak, understand, but sensitive. She feels things deeply. You'll need to be patient with her. Gentle. She's not like some of these mountain girls who are tough as leather. This information surprised Thomas. In the few interactions he'd had with Elizabeth, she had seemed emotionless, blank, a person going through motions without any internal life. The idea that she felt things deeply contradicted everything he'd observed as if summoned by his thoughts. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway that separated the front room from the kitchen. She was thin, almost gaunt, with pale skin that rarely saw the sun and light brown hair pulled back so severely it seemed to pull at her temples. Her dress was faded calico that had been washed so many times the pattern was barely visible, patched in several places with neat, small stitches that spoke of careful poverty. She didn't meet Thomas's eyes, keeping her gaze fixed on some point just above his left shoulder. "Father," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother needs you in the kitchen. Something about the preserves." Jacob excused himself with a grunt, leaving Thomas and Elizabeth alone for the first time in their lives. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filling the small room like smoke. A clock ticked on the mantel, marking seconds that felt like minutes. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Thomas spoke. Are you content with this arrangement? With our marriage?" Elizabeth's eyes flickered to his face for just a moment before darting away, like a bird startled by sudden movement. "It's a good match. Our families will benefit. The land will be secure." "That's not what I asked." For a moment, something flashed in her expression, anger, perhaps, or resentment, or maybe just resignation. Her hands, which had been clasped in front of her, clenched briefly into fists before relaxing again. "What I want doesn't matter, does it? What any of us want doesn't matter. This is what's expected. This is what's proper. This is what women do." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truth and accumulated bitterness. They were both trapped, both playing roles in a script written by their families and their culture and a society that valued property and propriety over personal happiness. "I'll try to be a good husband," Thomas offered, knowing even as he spoke how inadequate the words sounded, how empty the promise was. "And I'll try to be a good wife," Elizabeth replied, her voice flat and emotionless once more, the brief flash of feeling already extinguished. "That's all we can promise, isn't it? To try." As Thomas walked home through the dying afternoon light, the sun painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking toward a prison cell, not a marriage bed. And somewhere in his heart, a different name echoed, a name he could never speak aloud, a love he could never acknowledge in public, a desire that had to remain forever hidden if he wanted to survive in these mountains. That evening, unable to sleep despite the physical exhaustion from a long day's work, Thomas slipped out of the cabin after waiting for his mother and brother to fall asleep. He walked through the dark woods, following a path he knew by heart even in pitch blackness, every root and rock and turn memorized from months of secret nighttime journeys. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to see by once his eyes adjusted. The forest was alive with night sounds, owls calling, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, the distant howl of a coyote or perhaps a wolf. After 20 minutes of careful walking, he emerged at a small clearing where a rundown cabin stood, barely visible in the moonlight. It was smaller than even the McKenna place, perhaps 12 feet square, with a roof that needed repair and walls that had gaps where the chinking had fallen out. But smoke rose from the chimney, and a light flickered in the single window. He stopped at the edge of the trees, not daring to go closer, not daring to knock on that door even though everything in him wanted to. He stood there for nearly an hour, frozen between longing and duty, between desire and obligation, watching that flickering light and imagining the person inside, so close and yet impossibly distant that he never saw the figure standing in the cabin window, half hidden by a ragged curtain, watching him stand there in the darkness. Never saw the hand that reached out as if to open the door, then fell back. Never saw the tears that fell silently in that small, cold cabin. Finally, as the moon began to set and the cold became unbearable, Thomas turned back toward home, walking slowly, reluctantly, like a man heading toward his execution. Which, in a way, he was. October 14th arrived with unseasonable warmth, a last gasp of Indian summer before winter's inevitable approach. The temperature climbed into the low 70s by midday, and people shed their jackets with relief, knowing that such days would soon be just memories. Thomas spent the day helping his brother Samuel repair a section of fence that had collapsed during a recent storm, possibly from a falling tree or perhaps just from age and neglect. The physical labor felt good, the repetitive motion of hammering posts and stringing wire distracting him from tomorrow's ceremony, keeping his hands busy and his mind, temporarily, quiet. "You've been quiet lately," Samuel said, hammering a post into the rocky ground with powerful rhythmic strokes. "More than usual, I mean. And you're usually pretty quiet." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, squinting against the bright sun. Just thinking. About the wedding. Among other things. Samuel paused, studying his older brother with eyes that were more perceptive than Thomas usually gave him credit for. Despite the 9-year age difference, they had always been close, closer than many brothers. Maybe it was losing their father, or maybe it was just their natures. You know you don't have to go through with it, Samuel said quietly, glancing back toward the cabin to make sure their mother wasn't within earshot. Mother would be furious, and the shame would follow you for years. People would talk. But you'd survive. You could leave, go west, start over. And what would happen to Elizabeth? Thomas hammered a nail with more force than necessary, driving it deep into the wood. A bride left at the altar? She'd never marry after that. Her family would be humiliated. They'd probably have to leave the county just to escape the gossip. Her life would be ruined. So you're sacrificing your happiness for hers? Thomas didn't answer immediately, focusing on his work, measuring wire, cutting it with practiced efficiency. I'm doing what's right. What's expected. What men in these mountains have always done, putting duty before desire. That doesn't make it right. Thomas didn't respond because he knew his brother was correct. But knowing something was wrong didn't change the weight of obligation, didn't alter the course set in motion 6 months ago when two families shook hands over a deal, didn't undo generations of tradition and expectation. That evening, as the sun set in a spectacular display of purple and gold, the McKenna cabin filled with visitors, aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors from up and down the valley. It was traditional for the groom's family to host a gathering the night before the wedding, a celebration that served multiple purposes, affirming family bonds, displaying the family's hospitality, and giving the community a chance to wish the couple well. Martha had spent 2 days preparing for this, cooking and cleaning until the small cabin gleamed. She had prepared a feast by mountain standards. Fried chicken from their own birds, cornbread made with fresh ground meal, green beans cooked for hours with fatback until they were tender and savory, sliced tomatoes from the last of the garden, apple pie made from their own orchard with a crust that was the envy of every woman in the county. The small cabin overflowed with people and noise and laughter, the sound of fiddle music drifting through the cool evening air as someone played old mountain songs. Thomas stood on the porch, escaping the chaos inside, needing air and space and silence. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the mountain darkness, more stars than city folk could ever imagine existed. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy on the wooden planks, and turned to find his cousin Ruth approaching, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had never married, much to her mother's eternal disappointment and frequent complaints. "You look like a man heading to his execution, not his wedding," Ruth observed, lighting her pipe in defiance of propriety and her mother's frequent objections. The tobacco smell was sharp and familiar, comforting in its way. "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar, Thomas McKenna." She puffed on her pipe, sending smoke curling into the twilight, watching it disperse on the slight breeze. "I know that look. I've seen it before, in mirrors mostly. The look of someone in love with the wrong person." Thomas's heart seized, his hands gripping the porch railing hard enough that splinters bit into his palms. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ruth laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Don't insult my intelligence, boy. I've watched you for months now, sneaking off into the woods at night when you think everyone's asleep, coming back before dawn with that haunted expression on your face like you've been to hell and back. I've seen where you walk to. I've followed you." Terror gripped Thomas, cold and complete. Ruth knew who else might know. How many people had noticed his nighttime walks? How many had drawn conclusions, made assumptions? "You're mistaken." "Am I? Then why do you look so terrified right now? Why is all the color draining from your face?" Ruth took another puff, regarding him steadily. "Relax. Your secret's safe with me. I understand better than most what it's like to want something you can't have, to love someone that society says you shouldn't. I understand what it's like to live a lie." Thomas's voice came out as a whisper. "Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow you'll make a choice that can't be unmade. Marriage isn't something you can just walk away from, not in these mountains. Once those vows are spoken, you're bound. Legally, socially, morally. And I want you to be absolutely certain it's the right choice. Not the expected one. Not the proper one. Not the convenient one. The right one. Before Thomas could respond, his mother's voice called from inside, demanding his presence. Ruth patted his shoulder with surprising gentleness and went back into the cabin, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and fears and the terrible knowledge that his secret might not be as secret as he'd believed. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lay in the loft space he shared with Samuel, listening to his brother's steady breathing, staring at the rough wooden beams above his head and thinking about choices and consequences. He thought about Elizabeth, who deserved a husband who truly wanted her, who could love her the way a husband should. He thought about the land, the family expectations, the intricate web of obligations that bound everyone in these mountains. He thought about duty and desire, about what was expected and what was possible, and he thought about the person he could never have, never acknowledge publicly, never love openly without bringing shame and possibly violence down on both their heads. In these mountains, in this time, some loves were simply impossible. As dawn broke on October 15th, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't stop the wedding. Too many people would be hurt, too much damage would be done to innocent parties. Elizabeth didn't deserve to be humiliated. His mother didn't deserve to be shamed. Even Jacob Harmon, difficult as he was, didn't deserve to have his daughter rejected publicly, but he could leave a record. He could tell the truth in a way that might survive long after he was gone. He could create something that spoke honestly about this day, about this marriage, about the reality beneath the surface propriety. He found Samuel already awake, sitting on the porch steps and watching the sunrise. "I need your help with something," Thomas said quietly, sitting beside his brother. "Something strange. Something that's going to seem bizarre and possibly wrong. And I need you to never ask me why, and to never tell anyone else about it." Samuel studied his brother's face in the growing light, seeing something there that worried him. "What do you need?" "I need you to take a message to town, to that photographer who's staying at the boarding house. Web. Tell him I need to see him this morning before the wedding. Tell him I have a special request. A very special request." The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the Methodist church in town, giving people time to finish their morning chores and make the journey. By noon, the McKenna and Harmon families had gathered at their respective homes, dressed in their best clothes, which for most meant their only good clothes, carefully preserved for church and special occasions. Thomas wore his father's old suit, altered by his mother to fit, the fabric still smelling faintly of the cedar chest where it had been stored. Someone had picked wildflowers, the last of the season, to decorate the church. Reverend Patterson had prepared a short sermon about the sacred bonds of matrimony, about duty and faith and the proper ordering of households. But before they left for town, Thomas had one more thing to do. He had hired a traveling photographer named Augustus Webb, who had set up his equipment in the McKenna cabin while the family waited outside. Webb was a thin man with nervous hands and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, but he came highly recommended and possessed the specialized skills Thomas needed. Photography was still relatively rare in these parts, expensive and time-consuming and requiring equipment that most people never saw in their lives. The camera itself was a massive wooden box mounted on a sturdy tripod, with brass fittings and a complex lens system. The flash powder sat in a tray, ready to be ignited. Webb had already spent 20 minutes preparing, mixing chemicals, adjusting the lighting, positioning reflectors. "Just the couple," Webb instructed, positioning Thomas and Elizabeth in front of the old mirror that hung on the cabin's back wall, the same mirror that Martha had brought with her when she married. "Stand close together." Groom's hand on the bride's shoulder. "Both of you look at the camera. Try not to blink when the flash goes off." They posed stiffly, two people who barely knew each other pretending to be in love. The flash powder ignited with a burst of blinding light and acrid smoke that filled the small cabin. Webb nodded, satisfied. "Good. I'll need one more exposure, just to be certain we captured it properly. Sometimes the first attempt doesn't develop well." "Actually," Thomas said, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, "I have a specific request for the second photograph. Something unusual." What he asked for made Webb's eyebrows rise almost to his hairline. "That's unusual, sir. Highly unusual. I'm not even sure it's proper." But possible? Webb adjusted his spectacles, thinking. Technically, yes. If we use a double exposure technique, exposing the same plate twice with different positions, you'd need to pose twice, and we'd have to be very careful with the timing and positioning. It's quite a bit more work, and honestly, I'm not sure why you'd want such a strange image. I have my reasons, and I'll pay extra. Significantly extra. And I'll need your absolute discretion. You don't mention this to anyone. Ever. Webb studied Thomas's face, perhaps seeing something there that moved him. Very well. It's your money and your photograph. Who am I to judge? Thomas glanced at Elizabeth, expecting protest or questions, but she stood silent, her face completely unreadable. If she had opinions about this strange request, she kept them to herself, as she apparently kept everything to herself. The process took nearly an hour of careful work. First, Webb positioned Thomas alone, facing away from the mirror, and photographed just his reflection with the first exposure. Then, with painstaking care, he positioned both Thomas and Elizabeth in their wedding pose and made a second exposure on the same photographic plate. When the images were combined during development, the result would be exactly what Thomas wanted, a bride and groom standing together in front of a mirror, but in the mirror's reflection, the groom appeared to be turned completely away, facing the opposite direction. What happened? Thomas asked again, though he could already guess. He asked me to run away with him. He was going west, to California, looking for better opportunities. His father wanted him to stay and run the store, but David wanted more. He asked me to come with him, to leave everything and start a new life where no one knew us, where we could be anything we wanted. Her voice cracked. I said no. I was 17, terrified of my father, terrified of what people would say, terrified of everything that wasn't familiar. So I let him go. I watched him leave on the stage one morning, and I've regretted it every single day since. They sat in silence for a long moment, two people bound by a marriage neither wanted, each mourning loves they couldn't have. We're both prisoners, Thomas said finally, his voice flat and empty. But maybe we can be something other than husband and wife in the way our families expect. Maybe we can be friends, allies, people who understand each other's pain. People who can be honest with each other when we have to lie to everyone else. Thomas considered this. It wasn't love. It would never be romantic love. But perhaps it was something more valuable in their circumstances, understanding, honesty in a world that demanded constant lies. The photograph, Elizabeth said. Will you tell me the truth about why you did it? What you were trying to say? Thomas took a deep breath, making a decision. If they were going to be honest with each other, truly honest, then he might as well start now. I wanted to leave a record. Something that told the truth even if I couldn't speak it aloud. That photograph shows a groom turned away from his bride. It's exactly what our marriage is, me facing away from you, not because you're unworthy or unlovable, but because my heart faces elsewhere. It always has and it always will. I thought, someday maybe someone would see it and understand. That we tried, that we did what was expected, but that inside, in our hearts, we were always turned away from each other. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face, making tracks through the powder her mother had applied for the wedding. That's the saddest and most honest thing I've ever heard. I'm sorry, Thomas whispered. I'm so sorry you're trapped in this with me. You deserve better. And I'm sorry you're trapped with me. You deserve better too. We both do. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But we're here now. We've made our choices or had choices made for us. We might as well make the best of it. We might as well try to be kind to each other. They talked through the night, really talked, perhaps for the first time in their lives. They spoke of their separate heartbreaks, their frustrated dreams, the paths not taken. They spoke about the weight of family obligation, about the suffocating nature of mountain expectations, about what it meant to live a lie every day. They made a pact. They would play their roles as husband and wife in public, would work the land together, would present a united front to the world. But in private, they would be honest with each other. They would be the only people in each other's lives who knew the whole truth. Over the following years, Thomas and Elizabeth built a life together, not based on romantic love but on mutual respect and shared understanding. They had 3 children together, dutiful, necessary acts that created a family and satisfied expectations. They named them Martha, after Thomas's mother, Jacob, after Elizabeth's father, and Samuel, after Thomas's brother. They were good parents, loving in their own ways, though their children always sensed something absent in their parents' relationship, some warmth that never quite materialized, some distance that never quite closed. Thomas never stopped loving the person he couldn't have. Some years later, that person died. The details don't matter here, they're private grief, and Thomas mourned in silence, unable to express his loss to anyone except Elizabeth. She held him while he cried, understanding his pain completely because she carried her own similar burden. Elizabeth never stopped grieving David Chen, who had gone west and eventually sent a few letters that her father intercepted and destroyed. She only learned about them years later, when Jacob lay dying and confessed what he'd done, perhaps seeking absolution. Thomas was with her when she learned this, and he held her hand while she processed the knowledge that David had tried to reach her, that he hadn't simply forgotten her as she'd believed all those years. But despite their separate heartbreaks, Thomas and Elizabeth found a kind of peace in their shared honesty, in being 2 people who understood each other's burdens completely. They became true friends, perhaps even the best friends each other had. They worked together, raised their children together, grew old together. It wasn't the life either had wanted, but it was better than the life of constant lies that most people in their circumstances lived. The photograph from their wedding day was stored away in a wooden box, too strange to display on the wall with other family photographs, too meaningful to destroy. Eventually, as Thomas and Elizabeth aged and their children grew and had children of their own, the photograph passed to their daughter Martha, who passed it to her daughter Ruth, who passed it to her daughter Evelyn, each generation sensing there was a story behind it but never quite understanding what it meant, never quite daring to ask. Present day, conclusion and understanding. Sarah Mitchell's research took 3 months of intensive work. She traced the McKenna family through census records, land deeds, church documents, birth certificates, and death records. She found Thomas and Elizabeth's names repeated throughout the documents, their children's names, records of births and deaths and property transfers, and the slow, ordinary progress of a mountain family through the 20th century. They had lived long lives. Thomas died in 1944 at age 71, Elizabeth just 2 years earlier in 1942 at age 63, but the real breakthrough, the key that unlocked the whole mystery, came when she located Thomas McKenna's journal, donated to a small historical museum in Roan Mountain by a distant relative who had been cleaning out an attic and had no idea what he possessed. The journal was weathered and water-stained, with a leather cover that had rotted through in places, but most of the entries were still legible, written in careful, educated handwriting that surprised Sarah. Literacy wasn't guaranteed in these mountains in that era. Thomas had kept the journal sporadically, writing entries every few months when the mood struck him. Most entries were mundane, notes about weather, crop yields, repairs needed on various buildings. But some entries were deeply personal, revealing a thoughtful, introspective man struggling with circumstances beyond his control. The final entry, dated December 1942, just days after Elizabeth's death, read, "Elizabeth passed yesterday morning. The cancer took her quick at the end, which was a mercy. The pain had been terrible, though she bore it with more courage than I could have managed. We were married 43 years, and I will miss her more than I can say, though perhaps not in the way most widowers miss their wives. She knew me, really knew me, the parts one could never show anyone else, the truths I could never speak aloud. That was more than most people get in a lifetime. I'm grateful for it, even if it wasn't what either of us expected or wanted when we were young. I hope whoever finds the wedding photograph someday understands what we were trying to say. That love comes in many forms. That duty can be heavy beyond bearing. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is be honest about our pain, even if we can only be honest with one person, even if we can only tell the truth in coded ways. I'm tired. I'll join her soon enough, and maybe in whatever comes next, we'll both finally be free." Sarah sat in her office, the journal open before her on the desk, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the protective mat she always used when working with historical documents. She understood now. Everything made sense. The photograph wasn't about supernatural phenomena or photographic tricks meant to deceive. It was about truth. It was about two people trapped by their time and culture, trying to leave a record of their real selves, even as they fulfilled the roles demanded of them by society. She wrote up her findings carefully, spending weeks crafting the article that would eventually be published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies. She presented her research at a conference in Asheville, where her presentation was met with stunned silence followed by sustained applause. The photograph became something of a sensation, not because it was mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because it was heartbreakingly, devastatingly human. It spoke to anyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances, anyone who had ever loved the wrong person, anyone who had ever chosen duty over desire, anyone who had ever lived a life that didn't quite fit. The story of Thomas and Elizabeth McKenna spread through historical circles and eventually reached the general public through a documentary produced by PBS, through articles in national magazines, through social media posts that went viral. Their photograph became a symbol, not of haunting or mystery, but of courage. The courage to tell the truth in the only way they could. The courage to build a life together despite not being in love romantically. The courage to be kind to each other in the face of disappointment. The courage to find friendship and understanding in the most unlikely circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, their story became a reminder of how much had changed in a century and how much further we still had to go. The choices that had trapped and nearly destroyed Thomas and Elizabeth in 1899 would have been so different in a later era. They had been prisoners of their time, constrained by social norms that now seemed unbearably cruel. But their honest photograph had become a window, allowing future generations to look back and understand the price their ancestors paid for conformity, the cost of living in a society that demanded everyone fit into rigid roles regardless of their actual natures. On a cool autumn day, exactly 126 years after Thomas and Elizabeth's wedding, Sarah and Marcus stood at the small cemetery on a hillside outside Elizabethton where Thomas and Elizabeth were buried, their matching. Headstones simple and weathered but still legible. Someone had left wildflowers there recently, probably a descendant who had learned their story and wanted to pay respects to ancestors they finally understood. "Do you think they were happy?" Marcus asked, his hands in his pockets, looking at the graves. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think they found a kind of happiness. Not the one they would have chosen if given real freedom. Not the passionate romantic love that stories tell us we're supposed to find. But something real nonetheless. They had each other's honesty. They had genuine friendship. They had mutual understanding and respect. In a world of lies and pretense, in a society that demanded they hide their true selves, that was something profound. Maybe even something beautiful in its own tragic way." As they walked back to the car, Sarah thought about all the untold stories buried in history, all the people who had lived complex, hidden lives while presenting simple faces to the world. Thomas and Elizabeth's story had survived because of a single unusual photograph and a journal entry. How many others had been lost completely? How many people had lived and died without anyone ever knowing their true selves? The photograph now resided in the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville, properly preserved and cataloged, displayed under carefully controlled lighting and humidity. Thousands of visitors stopped to look at it each year, drawn by its strange composition and the tragic story it represented. The placard beside it told the full story of Thomas and Elizabeth, of their arranged marriage, of the secrets they kept and the understanding they found, of a love that couldn't exist in their time and place, of a friendship that sustained them through decades of difficulty. But what the placard couldn't quite capture, what no amount of historical documentation could fully convey, was the courage it took to create that image. In 1899 Appalachia, where conformity was survival and difference was potentially dangerous, where small communities watched everyone and enforced social norms through gossip and ostracism and sometimes violence, Thomas McKenna had found a way to tell his truth. His reflection turned away, forever facing the direction his heart wanted to go, while his body stood where duty demanded. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration, a whispered truth in a world of shouted expectations, and it had survived. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing. It had been carried forward by generations who sensed its importance even before they understood its meaning, preserved by people who knew, on some instinctive level, that this strange photograph mattered. Sarah liked to think that Thomas and Elizabeth would be pleased to know their story was finally understood, that their photograph had become a teaching tool, a conversation starter, a mirror reflecting not supernatural phenomena but the very human struggle between who we are and who we're expected to be. Their sacrifice, their compromised lives, their quiet courage, all of it meant something now in a way it never could have in their own time. The truth, she had learned through years of historical research, always finds a way out eventually. Sometimes it takes a century and the dedicated work of historians combing through archives and documents. Sometimes it comes wrapped in mystery and strangeness that draws attention. But it comes. Truth always comes, eventually, rising to the surface like air bubbles through water, and in the end, that was Thomas and Elizabeth's real legacy, not the land they accumulated or the children they raised, not the social respectability they maintained or the roles they performed, but the truth they found a way to preserve. A truth that whispered across generations. We were here, we suffered, we loved in ways we weren't allowed to love, we endured what we had to endure. Remember us. Understand us. Learn from us. Don't make the mistakes our society made. Don't trap people in the same cages that trapped us. The photograph remained, forever frozen in that moment in October 1899, a groom's reflection turned eternally away from his bride. But now, finally, people understood why. And in that understanding, Thomas and Elizabeth McKenna found the immortality and vindication that had been denied them in life, not as perfect representations of mountain marriage, not as examples to emulate, but as flawed, honest, courageous human beings who refused to let their truth die completely even when they couldn't speak it aloud. Their story became a bridge across time, connecting past pain to present understanding, reminding everyone who heard it that beneath every old photograph, behind every formal portrait, behind every seemingly simple historical record, real people lived and loved and struggled and survived. People who deserve to be remembered not as history wanted them to be, not as sanitized versions fit for textbooks, but as they truly were: complex, contradictory, human, and sometimes, if we look carefully enough, if we pay attention to the small details and anomalies, they leave us clues. A turned reflection. A journal entry. A photograph that doesn't quite make sense. Small acts of courage that echo through generations, waiting patiently for someone to finally understand, to finally bear witness to truths that were too dangerous to speak in their own time. Sarah Mitchell understood. Marcus Chin understood. And now, through their work and dedication, through the articles and documentary and museum display, the world understood too. The story of the 1899 Appalachian wedding photo wasn't about ghosts or supernatural phenomena or photographic anomalies. It was about something far more powerful and far more real, the enduring human need to be seen, to be known, to be remembered truthfully. Thomas and Elizabeth McKenna had ensured their truth survived, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment and the right people to decode it, and that, in the end, was perhaps the greatest achievement any of us can hope for, to leave behind some record of who we truly were, not who society wanted us to be. To reach across time and touch the future, saying, "This is who I was, this is what I felt, this is the truth I couldn't speak. Remember me truly, not as myth or legend, but as a person who lived and loved and made impossible choices and survived as best I could." Their message had been received. Finally, after more than a century, Thomas and Elizabeth's truth was known, and their reflection, that eternally turned away reflection, had become a symbol of hope. A reminder that truth survives. That courage matters. That even in the darkest times, when honesty seems impossible, there are ways to leave a record. Ways to ensure that someday, someone will understand. The autumn rain that had been falling when Sarah first discovered the photograph continued to fall, seasons turning into years, years turning into decades. But the truth endured. As it always does. As it always will.